And may I very warmly welcome everybody to Oxford Centre for Spiritual Growth this February afternoon. And it's lovely to be together. We will all be very mindful of the needs of the world at the moment. And I shall say a prayer which will include a prayer for God's blessing this afternoon, but also a prayer for those in Ukraine and elsewhere. So before anything else, let us pray. Almighty God, we thank you for one another, and we thank you through the centuries, through time of peace and of war. There has been a desire to learn, a desire to be in fellowship, a desire therefore to learn together. So we pray for your blessing on our time this afternoon. We thank you for Mark, and thank you for all that he means and all that he can give. But we do remember and pray for the people of the Ukraine.
Oh, they're just waiting.
And we pray for your protection for those who are working so hard for peace. We pray for the leaders of the world. We pray for all those this day who are anxious, who are suffering, who are grieving, who are refugees. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all again so much for being here, and thank you to Ben for all the organising in the background. A shameless plug resulting from our last OCSG meeting. If any of us don't have a copy yet of Ben's wonderful book, there are still some copies left. Look, he's turned off his video camera in modesty at that moment, but it is a wonderful selection of poems and prose, highly commended. Thank you, Ben, for that. And thank you, Mark, so much for joining us. Well, I would say from Cambridge, but you're joining us in Cambridge, and we're looking forward very much to this afternoon. Very briefly, Mark is Dean of St John's College, Cambridge at the moment, was at St Paul's Cathedral before, was I think an archdeacon in Germany before that. He writes wonderfully, thinks wonderfully, speaks wonderfully. Lots of things you can look up happily on Wikipedia. In honor of this afternoon, he's purchased a new headset as well, so we're very grateful and honored for that. But if I could just say a personal note, I first came across Mark, we didn't actually meet, when I was a governor of a school in London, and they were having their 450th anniversary celebration service at St Paul's Cathedral, and Mark gave the address. And I was very struck by two things, which I think says a lot about him, great deal about him. First of all, it was a marvelous address and kept students and staff and parents and governors in rapt attention. Secondly, he had clearly done his homework. He knew a great deal about the school, knew a great deal of what it stood for. And just occasionally, dare I say, one goes to things like this and you think, well, the speaker is maybe a wonderful talk, but they're recycling something they've done before. But Mark clearly, with all integrity, had worked so hard on this. I was grateful that day, and very grateful, Mark, that you're with us this afternoon. That's more than enough from me. So I'm just going to hand over to you. But just to say, everybody, we are going to have a 15-minute break in the middle. If anybody has any questions, urgent questions, that you'd like Mark to try and tackle in the second half, weaving them seamlessly in, then maybe just let's put that in the chat. There we go. Mark, over to you. Do say anything I may have left out.
No, that's great.
Oh, you, yes.
That's right. Can you hear me now? Good. Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you. It's very good to be here with everyone. And as I begin, I'm very conscious of Georgie Simpson, who first invited me to lead some studies for the centre, and to whom I owe such a lot, not least in the very gentle but firm encouragement that she always gave me. I miss her, and I hope that this afternoon is something she would have enjoyed being part of. I'm hoping she rests in love. In these two talks I'm going to give, the picture that I'm going to talk about and the poems I refer to, I've put on a handout, and that's going to be sent to you when I finish. So all the references to the various poems that I mentioned, they're all going to be listed there. And there's also the recommended reading list as well, and also a photograph of the remarkable face of W.H. Auden, not me, W.H. Auden, because he did have quite a memorable face. First of all, though, let me just look at my title, Life Remains a Blessing. That's a quote from one of Auden's poems, which we'll come to, but the second part is Lent with W.H. Auden. And I just want to say a few things first about Lent, which begins next week. For me, Lent is the time of a snowfall in the soul. If you think of what the snow does to us when it comes, it reimagines our landscape. Everything looks a bit different. It asks of us to be sure where and how we want to travel. Its warm chill allows us to see our own breath. It tempts us to see if we might be a bit more playful, a bit more thoughtful about our neighbours. And all that is really what Lent enables in us if we allow it. It's been said that the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. And Lent is a time that's set aside each year to take that thought seriously. And a few years ago, there was a story in the papers about a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's currently on display in Vienna, but Krakow's National Museum claims that it's theirs and that it was stolen by the wife of the city's Nazi governor in 1939 during the occupation of Poland. And I'm not going to show it you now here, because actually what happens when I try to share it, as I've explored, is that the details all get lost, and it's the details that matter. So it's called The Fight Between Carnival and Lent, and I hope that you'll take a look at it sometime over the next few days. The Fight Between Carnival and Lent, and it was painted in 1559. It's a beautiful, I'm just going to very quickly talk about what the picture is, and then when you take your own look at it in your own time, you'll see some of these things. But it's a typical Bruegel painting. It's a large, very crowded canvas with nearly 200 men, women and children on it. We find ourselves looking down on this town, and there's a riotous festival going on. It's lots of colour, and the painting can sort of be divided into two halves. On the right of the painting, you're going to see a church with people leaving after prayer. You can see them as they leave giving alms to the poor, feeding the hungry, helping those with disability, calling attention to people in need, helping them, and tending to the dying. On the left-hand side, you see an inn, and congregated around it are beer drinkers, gamblers, various saucy types. Think of EastEnders on a Monday night. Here, the vulnerable are not being noticed, and that includes a solitary procession of lepers, and instead you see a man who's vomiting out the window, and another is banging his head against a wall. In the foreground, you see two figures that are being pulled towards each other on floats. One is Lady Lent. She's gaunt, unshowy, dressed as a nun, with followers eating fish and pretzels, and water is being drawn from a well nearby. The other is Carnival. He's rather a fat figure. He's armed with a meat spit and a pork pie for a helmet, and he's being followed by masked carousers. There's a man in yellow, for instance. Yellow, of course, is the symbolic colour of deceit, and he's pushing the float, and everybody's rather weighed down by cups and belongings. And in the background, you see some trees. You have to look very closely for this, but on the left, they're rather leafless. And on the right, you can just see the buds coming through. And also, right in the background, get out your magnifying glass, but you will see a woman who's busily cleaning her windows. This is all an allegorical delight. And you might, as I say, do worse during Lent than spending some time with it. It's tempting as you look at it to classify every human being on the painting as either good or bad, secular or faithful, kind or indifferent. And of course, this plays to our natural tendencies. We love to place people into cutlery trays, dividing us all up as is most useful for us. But what I love about this painting is that it reminds me that we're all similarly made with these two halves. For many of us, there is a constant fight going on within between the times we are negligent, the times we are careful, days in which we get through with a self that enjoys its own attention, being center stage, and days when our self feels somehow more itself not being selfish, a bit more out of view. So we can have an impulse to pray, we can have an impulse to avoid it. There are parts of us that can be grotesquely masked, and there are lots of those in the painting. And there are parts of me trying to clean my windows on a ladder, as it were, wanting to increase transparency and attention to the world. And Lent begins, of course, with a small dusty cross being made on your head, this hard case that protects the organ that makes decisions. The season starts by asking me to imagine how life might be if the imprint of Christ's courageous compassion might make itself felt and acted on rather than just talked about. Lent knows what we are like. It's seen the painting, it's read its Freud, Lent has read its history, it knows our political manifestos, it's read our memoirs of hurt, it winces at our cyclical self-destructive repetitions, but Lent believes in us, knowing that with God and with each other, if we reach outside of our own hardened little worlds, we set the scene to be helped and maybe even changed. So I don't know who owns that Bruegel painting that you're going to have a look at, but what I do know is that its themes belong to all of us. Our inner landscape matches this rowdy town square. And as long as that fight continues, the soul is breathing. Now, those preliminary comments about Lent lead me to say that that's why we can do a lot worse than invite W.H. Auden to be our companion through the season. And I'm here to explain why I think that, why these themes were ones he took seriously in his own work, and why to read some of his poems over the next 6 weeks might be more than helpful to us. And over the last days, I think Auden has become even more topical. I'll look a little at his life in a moment, but around October 1940, Auden, at the age of 33, and who had laid aside his Christian faith about the age of 16, began, he said, going in a tentative and experimental way to church again. And at the time, he was living in New York, in Brooklyn Heights, with Benjamin Britten, Peter Pears, and a couple of others. What a household that must have been. One of the people staying there was Golo Mann. And Mann wrote later of this period that on Sundays, Auden began to disappear for a couple of hours and returned with a look of happiness on his face. After a few weeks, he confided in me the object of these mysterious excursions, the Episcopal Church. Well, as war was taking place in Europe in 1940, Auden had come to believe that both his early Marxism and his liberal humanism, his interests in science, in Freud and psychology, had all failed to prevent the moral disaster called fascism and the horrors it was bringing to Europe. He saw that clearly, this came home to him very vividly in a famous incident in which he witnessed at a cinema in New York about this time, a film about the Nazi invasion of Poland. And when Polish people appeared on the screen in the film, Auden said that a number of quite ordinary, supposedly harmless Germans in the audience were shouting, "Kill the Poles, kill the Poles." I wondered, he said, why I reacted as I did against the denial of every humanistic value. The answer brought me back to the church. It was that same year that Auden wrote a gravely beautiful poem of over 1,000 lines, so I'm not going to read it all to you. Its title was New Year Letter. And it was addressed to Elizabeth Meyer, who was a refugee from Germany and a close friend of Auden. It contains a complex of ideas about humanity, history, art, civilization, violence, all the themes that were in the air at the time. And at the end of this poem, New Year Letter, he addresses his friend Elizabeth and draws attention to what she brings to the world. He writes, "We fall down in the dance. We make the old ridiculous mistake, but always there are such as you, forgiving, helping what we do. Oh, every day in sleep and labor, our life and death are with our neighbor, and love illuminates again the city and the lion's den, the world's great rage, the travel of young men." Well, as war strikes Europe again, and as we are watching in horror and disbelief and restless agitation as what we should do, what we can do, what we can't do, we really are entering the world that gave rise to so much of Auden's poetry and to the rise of his renewed Christian faith. I wouldn't say it was his conversion, I'd say it was his reconversion to Christian faith. The belief that our life and death are with our neighbor became the very heart of his belief, something he returns to again and again in his work. His religious faith was the leap into believing that we are made whole as people and societies in love of God and neighbor. And evil for him was a privation of such wholeness that is shaped by that love. Auden embraced religion as the only mature way to understand human darkness and human potential. And the point of Christian belief, he argued, was to challenge our self-deceptions and self-pity and keep us focused on the only thing that matters, Jesus Christ's love command. He wrote, "For one thing, and one thing only, is serious, loving one's neighbor as oneself." Some years later, he wrote a curious little poem called The More Loving One. And in it, we find an acceptance that in the face of meaninglessness or indifference, it is still possible to be engaged in the world. It's still possible to love. These are the first two stanzas of the poem. "Looking up at the stars, I know quite well that for all they care, I can go to hell. But on earth, indifference is the least we have to dread from man or beast. How should we like it were stars to burn with a passion for us we could not return? If equal affection cannot be, let the more loving one be me. So much of Auden's 30s poetry seemed apt for the times. It has a great sense of things about to go wrong, unreason about to be unleashed. Then you have the slightly later poems of Auden looking on at this murderous destruction by aggressors. And he finds himself drawn to the expressions of value in the doctrines and rituals of Christianity, those expressions of value, signposts to something that's difficult to explain, but the only thing that can bring to life the sense of order and meaning that he was seeking. So by 1941, in a review of a book, he was complaining about the prudery of cultured people to whom talk of God was far more shocking than any four-letter words. He says, these people whose childish memories associate religion with vague and pious verbiage. And he laments in this review that such people can't understand that you can be a thinking person and a religious person at the same time. Who knew? Auden was someone for whom thought and faith did not merely coexist, they actually nourish each other. And his faith very much expanded the horizons of his mind as well as his heart. And his intelligence, which was formidable, probed the nature and limits of his own Christian belief and animated a continuous quest not only to believe still, he said, but also to believe again. So there's always a search for the conversion of the Christian inside, to believe again, not just to believe still. In so many ways then, Auden's themes and Auden's world are our themes and our world again. Here are the last two verses of his poem, September the 1st, 1939. All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority, whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies. Yes, dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. So, who was W.H. Auden? I'm often asked who my favorite poet is, and I always find it a very impossible question to answer. It depends what day you ask me, I think. But I'll always mention, R.S. Thomas and George Herbert and a few others. But if pushed, I tend to land quite quickly on W.H. Auden. And I remember very vividly, actually, the first poem I read by him at school. I was about 14, I think. Here it is, Song 8. At last, the secret is out, as it always must come in the end. The delicious story is ripe to tell to the intimate friend. Over the teacups and in the square, the tongue has its desire. Still waters run deep, my dear. There's never smoke without fire. Behind the corpse in the reservoir, behind the ghost on the links, behind the lady who dances and the man who madly drinks, under the look of fatigue, the attack of migraine and the sigh, there's always another story. There is more than meets the eye. For the clear voice suddenly singing high up in the convent wall, the scent of the elder bushes, the sporting prints in the hall, the croquet matches in summer, the handshake, the cough, the kiss. There is always a wicked secret, a private reason for this. I was always intrigued by that poem. I still am actually reading it again. Menacing, unsettling, and yeah. So that was the first poem I read of Auden, and it beguiled me, I think. What's often forgotten when people are talking about Auden is that he was a poet with Christian faith, and people often talk about Eliot and other Christian poets, but they often don't talk about Auden under the bracket of Christian. But he took his faith very seriously, and he engaged imaginatively with it. And as we start this little exploration together, I'm very conscious, of course, of something he also said, which I ought to keep in mind as I go on. A poem should always be more interesting than anything we can say about it. So the one prayer I often pray is, lead us not into interpretation. So I won't try and do that too much today. I'm going to try and let the poems stand for themselves a bit. And of course, you can always go back to them yourself. Not everyone knows much about Auden, of course. Strangely, it was his face that is more famous than his poetry sometimes. It became very craggy by creasing very deeply in later life, and has been compared over the years to a dry riverbed, an elephant's hide in the mud, and in his own words, a wedding cake that's been left out in the rain. Cecil Beaton did some very beautiful pictures of his transition from youth to age. Then I suppose some of his love poetry had a surge of popularity after the actor John Hannah read his funeral blues in that film 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Can you believe that that was out in 1994? Funeral Blues is actually a cabaret song that was written by Auden for a play that he jointly wrote with his friend Christopher Isherwood, The Ascent of F6. The music was composed by Britten. And just in case you've forgotten it, I always think we ought to hear it again. Funeral Blues. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone, silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. Let aeroplanes circle, moaning overhead, scribbling on the sky the message, he is dead. Put crape bows round the white necks of the public doves. Let the traffic policeman wear black cotton gloves. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not wanted now. Put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood. for nothing now can ever come to any good. Another one of his poems became popular following 9/11, a poem called September the 1st, 1939. It's actually a poem that Auden grew to dislike very much and began to leave out of publications because he said he thought it was dishonest. He when he wrote it, he says, was not true to the feelings he really had inside when he wrote it. So he thought it was a dishonest poem. He was a poet, by the way, for whom, when it came to language, truth was always at stake and self-scrutiny was of the first order. He was always revising. He was a great reviser of his work. And Auden's literary executor and biographer, Edward Mendelssohn, has stated rather boldly that Auden was the first poet writing in English who felt at home in the 20th century. And what he means, I think, is that Auden relished the ideas and the work of novelists, historians, theologians, philosophers, psychologists, anthropologists, political scientists of the day. He had no great romance about the past or hatred of the future. He was very much in the present as a poet. Everything is life-size in his work. He was the first English poet to be influenced by psychoanalytical theories, such as Freud, and by Marxist theories as well. To read Auden really is to be immersed in a sort of poetic encyclopedia of the 20th century. It's a very creative engagement with that century, that incredible century, but a very fractured one. And when he was given a great prize in America, the National Medal for Literature in 1967, they concluded that Auden had illuminated our lives and times with grace, wit, and vitality. His work, branded by the moral and ideological fires of our age, breathes with eloquence, perception, and intellectual power. That's how they concluded his contribution. Well, he was certainly quick to establish his own distinctive poetic voice as a young man. He often omitted, in these very early days, the definite article. He inverted word order. It's an almost breathless poetry, seeming, as somebody once said, that there was only ever time to write the words that matter most. Everything else seemed to have been forgotten. It's always, with Auden, a poetry that's alert to the sound of the words. And he developed in a very versatile and inventive ways this language of feeling, of moral and spiritual truths that he was exploring, always seeking order. He loved categories and categorizing and ordering, and he was always seeking them out. Some critics call Auden anti-romantic because of this analytical clarity for order, for universal patternings of existence. But it is always versatile, and he uses an enormous range of poetic forms throughout his life. Just so you know, he publishes about 400 poems in his life, which is quite a thick book. As you can see, here's the Faber, edited by Mendelssohn, the collected poems. So that's going to keep you going through Lent. Interesting when you compare it to somebody like George Herbert, who only wrote about 170. We've got about 400 of Auden's. They include 7 long poems, 2 of them are book length. And you get a whole range of style, from obscure 20th century modernism to very traditional forms of ballad and limerick and doggerel and haiku and villanelle, to a Christmas oratorio and a Baroque eclogue, he calls it, in Anglo-Saxon meter. I mean, this is a restless, intelligent mind who's very versatile in what he can do. And the tone and the content of these poems ranges from pop song cliches to complex philosophical meditations. He can sometimes write a poem about the corns on his toes, to the atoms and the stars, from contemporary crises to the evolution of society. And as you work your way through all this collection, you feel really as if you've landed in one of those, you know, when you go to some museums, they have this Wunderkabinet, you know, a little piece of furniture you buy to show off all these exotic things you've collected from around the world. And I always feel opening his collected poems is a bit like that. Some prefer his earlier work to and his middle work to the later work, but people differ about that. I do think when I've read quite a lot of critics about Auden, the one that really made me smile, because I sort of know what he meant, was he simply said, "I read Auden, I shuddered, and I knew." I'll leave that with you as to what that might mean, but it resonates a bit with me. I read him, I shuddered, and I knew. And as we, you know, look and think about one or two of these poems, do remember the democracy of poetry. The wonderful thing about it is everybody's got an interpretation of it, a meaning in response to it. Poetry, as somebody said, is the clear expression of mixed feelings. So you're not excavating for the one true meaning of this poem, which lies, you know, like a wisdom tooth, which you've got to go and find somewhere deep down. Poems are not like that. They're generative of meanings, and you just have to bear them as they emerge. But very quickly, Auden was born in York. He was raised in Birmingham. His father was a prominent physician with a very extensive knowledge of mythology and folklore. His mother was a strict Anglican missionary nurse, so Anglicanism was in his background. She was not very accepting of her son's ways, always complaining about his untidiness and eating any food he came across. But these were two very strong influences on his life and poems. He goes to prep school, which he says was ruled by malignant devils. And then he goes to public school, to Gresham's in Norfolk, which was reasonably liberal at the time, although he did say later that all he knew about totalitarianism was learned in his public school. He was there with Benjamin Britten and Donald MacLean, and it was while he was at school that he began to write poems. He went for a walk with a friend one day in the countryside, and the friend said to him, "Tell me, do you ever write poetry?" And that's one of those historical moments, rather similar to when someone once said to Shakespeare, "Ever thought about writing a play about a Danish prince?" Auden always looked back to that conversation as when he knew, as when he was asked that question, that that's what he wanted to do. He was a person of what you might call arbitrary, extreme decisions. And he always referred to that conversation as the beginning of his work as a poet. He had this interest, though, in science and engineering. He gets a scholarship to Christ Church, Oxford, but he changes subject to English because of his fascination with poetry that's developing. And he never loses that interest in science, however. There's a lot of scientific references in his poem. He reads the poets of the modernist type, particularly that of Eliot. He becomes pivotal in a group of writers at the time called the Oxford Group, or now called the Auden generation. Stephen Spender, C.D. Lewis, William McNeice, and so on. And the group adheres to various Marxist and anti-fascist doctrines, which he gets very caught up with. Somebody has said that those early poems of his send up the old pieties, all the old pieties of English culture he sends up. I suppose you could say, and I know one or two of these now in my present job, he was a clever undergraduate. He was gay, he was the center of a court of the clever, and people looked up to him. He becomes more political, he goes to Berlin, he develops left-wing views, anti-fascist principles. He goes to Spain, intending to drive an ambulance in the Civil War. He was a terrible driver, by the way, so it's just as well he didn't. He goes to China with Isherwood, he goes to Iceland with McNeice, and then he publishes his first book of poems in 1828. And you can, when you read those, detect people like Hardy as influences, Wilfred Owen, Edward Thomas, and so on. Auden's poems from the second half of the 1930s evidence all these travels. Spain is one of his most famous poems, I suppose. And there, of course, is this journey to war that he writes, a book of the period that he writes with Isherwood. And it's exactly what it is, a period of journeying to war, what he calls the age of anxiety. And he writes a poem in 1947 called that, The Age of Anxiety. And this strikes a chord in a readership. It's a sort of timely treatment of the waves of the time. He teaches at schools. He's very good at lecturing people. He leaves England in 1939 with Isherwood. He becomes a citizen of the United States. That didn't go down very well. People said he was retreating from the war and he was a coward. Those who know him say that wasn't the case at all. They thought that it was about him wanting to make his living as a poet, and that was more likely in America. He wanted to make poetry pay. He was very proud, by the way, that he did make poetry pay and got through his life by simply being a poet. He did, from America, call up the British Embassy and offered to return to help the war effort, but they said, no, thank you, we need skilled people. So he never did. His reputation's growing in America. He's lecturing, he's writing criticism, and he becomes one of the foremost poets of the English language at the time. And around this time, some of his more famous poems now are published, including Musée des Beaux-Arts, which was inspired by another Bruegel painting, Fall of Icarus. You may know it. Here it is. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water. and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. Following several other noted publications, The Double Man, for the time being, The Sea and the Mirror, he then puts together his collected poetry, and this begins to solidify his reputation. A little bit later, you're getting other works that are now well known, including, of course, his very famous poem In Praise of Limestone. He's got this formidable technique and a very acute ear. And as I say, you can always detect the musicality of what he's writing at this time. I've mentioned some of his beliefs and ideologies. The extent to which he believed in all these political theories is still debated. What's clear to some critics, though, is that Auden habitually did revise his writing to accommodate all the shifts in his faith and belief. So he was always trying to write poems that caught up with himself. Auden had read a lot of theology, by the way, and when he returns to Christianity, to a form of Anglo-Catholicism, it's very informed, particularly by Augustine and by Kierkegaard. He begins to write libretti with his partner Chester Kalman. He spends summer in Italy, and they buy a house in Austria. In New York, he lived in Greenwich Village, by the way. I visited it not too long ago. And then later in life, he returns to the UK and lives in a cottage in the gardens of Christ Church. He was professor of poetry at Oxford, but he was a rather lonely figure by then. And he sits alone in cafes in carpet slippers. He was very messy, always had dirty fingernails and went round in his slippers, always covered in cigarette ash. Michael Parkinson, when he interviewed him, actually thought he could see some of the ash lying in the creases of his face. But he was very kind towards young writers and prisoners he would write to, for instance. There was an unseen kindness to Auden, which certainly was very much there when he was a lonely figure. He dies in a hotel room in Vienna and is buried in Austria, in Kirchstetten, where he had his house. And at his funeral, the village band played and processed. He was very popular in the village. There's a lovely little book which I've put on the book list by Alexander McCall Smith, who is a great fan of Auden. And he says about Auden's life, these are the simple, stripped down facts, but they conceal so much. An immensely complex body of work in which there are layers of meaning and reference that could take a lifetime to understand. A noble and generous heart, a courteous and urbane citizen of a troubled century, a man who somehow seems to speak personally to his reader. They conceal a person who might be the best of guides to the inescapable task of being human, who might, if we allow him, really change our lives. So let's end this session with a poem that links to what I said right at the start about his times being our times again. Here is his poem, Refugee Blues. Say this city has 10 million souls. Some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. Yet there's no place for us, my dear. Yet there's no place for us. Once we had a country and we thought it fair. Look in the atlas and you'll find it there. We cannot go there now, my dear. We cannot go there now. In the village churchyard there grows an old yew. Every spring it blossoms anew. Old passports can't do that, my dear. Old passports can't do that. The consul banged the table and said, "If you've got no passport, you're officially dead." But we are still alive, my dear. But we are still alive. Went to a committee, they offered me a chair, asked me politely to return next year. But where shall we go today, my dear? But where shall we go today? Came to a public meeting. The speaker got up and said, "If we let them in, they will steal our daily bread." He was talking of you and me, my dear. He was talking of you and me. Thought I heard the thunder rumbling in the sky. It was Hitler over Europe saying they must die. Oh, we were in his mind, my dear. Oh, we were in his mind. Saw a poodle in a jacket fastened with a pin. Saw a door opened and a cat let in. But they weren't German Jews, my dear. But they weren't German Jews. Went down the harbour and stood upon the quay. Saw the fish swimming as if they were free. Only 10 feet away, my dear. Only 10 feet away. Walked through a wood, saw the birds in the trees. They had no politicians and sang at their ease. They weren't the human race, my dear. They weren't the human race. Dreamed I saw a building with 1,000 floors, 1,000 windows, and 1,000 doors. Not one of them was ours, my dear. Not one of them was ours. Stood on a great plain in the falling snow. 10,000 soldiers marched to and fro, looking for you and me, my dear. Looking for you and me. Shall we meet at, again, in 1/4 at 3:10?
Certainly so. Thank you, Mark, so much for that first session. Thank you, everybody. Look forward to seeing you back at 3:10.
Good to be back, and it's very difficult to talk on Zoom. When I'm with a group of people, I can always sense how it's going and whether people are enjoying it or not. I'm just ploughing on in the hope that somebody out there is enjoying something of it, but let's hope so anyway. In this second session, I want to just make some general remarks about what we can make of Auden's Christian faith. Hard though that project can be at times, for a reason I'll explore a little bit later. But then I want to finish by coming back to Lent and how Auden might help with where I began about all that exploring of divided selves and completeness. I think one of the things that some people don't know, but I think it's relevant, is that both Auden's grandfathers were clergy. And you do find that when he turns back, as it were, to Christian faith, there's already a language in him, innate, learned, a vocabulary for his thinking, but also for his inner life, his inner landscape, which has been provided by his family upbringing and of course his school. Some of Auden's very last poems in his life were haikus, and often they take the form of prayers. This was a newish development for him. One says, for instance, his thoughts pottered from verses to sex to God without punctuation. Put that on your gravestone. His thoughts pottered from verses to sex to God without punctuation. I think what I want to say as I reflect on his Christian faith is that there's a sort of rounded integrity about his Christian ancestry and his Christian end. There's another nice haiku, again written quite late, where he says, he has never seen God, but once or twice he believes he has heard him. Rather sort of R.S. Thomasy there. But anyway, he is not afraid to take on those cultured despisers of which he wrote about in 1941, those prudes who didn't like religious language because they thought it was ridiculous. He certainly does take on some of that language, particularly as he ages. And many of his admirers mistrust, dislike, or minimize this religious element, as I said, to his poetry, focusing on all the other many things that his poetry evokes. But Auden, as I said, was a person who wished to be someone who, if I can put it this way, and it's not a bad project for all of us, somebody who can think critically, but is trying to live faithfully. And I think both those things were very important to him. And as I said, his quest was not only to believe still, but also to believe again. So he was very conscious of continual reconversions that you need in yourself, particularly if you're religious, because it's so easy to go along with the status quo and for everything to go on autopilot. You need to be revivified by your faith. Auden, as I said, was drawn to reading a lot of Søren Kierkegaard, that whole idea that you have to make that leap of faith beyond reason in order to understand reason, as it were. But he also did read a lot of Augustine. And he liked Augustine because he said Augustine showed that Christian faith can make sense of both a private and a social experience of life. He has written some very specifically religious poems for the time being as a Christmas oratorio. Now, a lot of people don't like it. They find it a little bit cheap, a bit gaggy, a bit sort of less than. But there are elements of it, and it's far too long for me to explore with you.
It's just at the top, https validator
coming in. There is some, as I say, debate as to the value of it, but I quite like parts of it very much. And here's a little example.
I'm sorry, on the what?
This is coming from
back button. Right. Yes.
Anthony, are you able to?
I'm just trying to search through. So what I'm going to do now, I've muted everybody, Mark. So if you could kindly unmute yourself. Thank you. Apologies, everybody.
So this is from For the Time Being, and of course, play on words. If it's about Christmas, it's about the incarnation. It's about a being coming into time. For the time being. He is the way, follow him through the land of unlikeness. You will see rare beasts and have unique adventures. He is the truth. Seek him in the kingdom of anxiety. You will come to a great city that has expected your return for years. He is the life. Love him in the world of the flesh, and at your marriage, all its occasions shall dance for joy. Now that expression, land of unlikeness, is straight from Augustine's Confessions. I found myself to be a long way from thee in the region of unlikeness. That's how it's translated. And there's a very good example of how Augustine's theology of return, which is so important to Auden as a theme, of course. And you get it in that he is truth.
Thank you very much for your efforts, Rory.
Apologies, I need
so
to
difficult.
be doing this again. There we go. Thanks.
When you get, you will come to a great city that has expected your return for years. So that sense of returning out of the land of unlikeness. And those three little stanzas that I've read from for the time being, I think the reason I just wanted to mention them is that I think in their own way they show a little element of Auden's faith that we can piece together from the bits and pieces that he wrote and spoke sometimes about his faith. That achievement of the city of God on earth, the love of the word made flesh that's being understood in the world of the flesh and in this kingdom of anxiety. So open-eyed about the anxiety, but also not making his faith into some sort of spiritual hot air balloon, drifting away from reality, very much a faith that's immersed in the flesh, incarnation. And that was very, very important to him, as you'll see from a quotation I'll give you a little bit later. So no sense of the Christian faith, if I can put it like this, is some sort of faith to take you from the world. Quite the opposite. Faith is to prepare you to be in the world. And of course, you can see where that might have come from when he was so distraught at how nobody was stopping fascism. Excuse me. A friend of his, Ursula Niebuhr, said that his Auden's Christianity was too exploratory and capacious to be pigeonholed. I think that's true. There is huge faith in him, but also skepticism and a belief that doubt is essential. He liked Kierkegaard's sort of reference to reason's depravity. So he knew that faith, as it were, had to rupture reason in order to awake the soul out of its own self-deceptions. He thought that the power of sin was our refusal to admit our creatureliness. Any attempt that we have to be more than we are, to be more than mere creatures created, he thought was the power of sin, pride. And as I said, he believed that Christian faith had to be understood in the now. He believed in life before death, not as some sort of preparation for heaven. And he says, eternity is the decision now, the action now, one's neighbor here. There's that theme again about the neighbor and the command to love the neighbor as the self. So key to his understanding of the importance of Christianity in the world. And he wrote a work called Horae Canonicae, and these poems that he wrote correspond to the monastic canonical hours, the services that a religious community has through the day, immersing, as it were, time in prayer. And he writes these, and actually they're not as well known as they ought to be. So again, there's a little Lenten exercise for you to spend a little bit of time with them. I think they are certainly parables of his faith. And I'm going to read you one of them, which is about the morning when you first wake up. It's the first service of the day, prime. And I'll read you that in a second. But The other thing I just want to mention at this point is Jesus. So I have said to you that, of course, Jesus's love command was essential to his belief. But he says something very interesting about Jesus, and you really have to scurry around to find this little nugget. But when somebody interviewed him, why Jesus, why not Buddha, why not Muhammad, why? He says, because he is in every respect the opposite of what he would be if I could have made him in my own image. So if I was to come up with a savior, Jesus is exactly the opposite of what I would have come up with. And because of that, he is revealing my self-deceptions, my ability to make God in my own image. A bit like Voltaire, if triangles believed in God, he'd be three-sided. And the fact that Christ, the figure of Christ, subverts everything that Auden himself would, be shaping up as a savior, is actually the importance of Christ to him. And he says, it's rather shocking, but you get the point. He says, when people said, well, why not the others? He said, none of them arouse all sides of my being to cry, crucify him. It's everything that he is challenging in me, all those things that I would like to be the case. The fact that he's challenging all that makes me want to shout out, crucify him. And he said, that's why he's important. It's a very interesting conversation that he had about the importance of Jesus to his faith. Anyway, here is part of the canonical hours. He began thinking of these in about 1947, so quite soon after his coming back to church. He wrote them from 1949 to 54. And here's the first one. And it's difficult, there's quite a bit of difficulty in Auden. Let's not be scared of it, though. And this is, he's taking up the theme of the first prayer of the day, and he's playing with the ideas of human beings that come to self-consciousness. We wake up, we're sleepy, we come into consciousness, but also then we develop a consciousness not only of ourself, but of the beyond, of place and time and space that we find ourselves in. So it's a little bit longer than some of the others, but as I say, you can always go back to it. But here it is. Prime. Simultaneously, as soundlessly, spontaneously, suddenly, as at the vaunt of the dawn, the kind gates of the body fly open to its world beyond, the gates of the mind, the horn gate and the ivory gate swing to, swing shut, instantaneously quell the nocturnal rummage of its rebellious frond, ill-favoured, ill-natured and second-rate, disenfranchised, widowed and orphaned by an historical mistake, recalled from the shades to be a seeing being, from absence to be on display, without a name or history, I wake between my body and the day. Holy this moment, holy in the right, as in complete obedience to the light's laconic outcry, next as a sheet, near as a wall, out there as a mountain's poise of stone, the world is present, about, and I know that I am here, not alone, but with a world, and rejoice unvexed, for the will has still to claim this adjacent arm as my own, the memory to name me, resume its routine of praise and blame, and smiling to me is this instant, while still the day is intact, and I, the Adam sinless in our beginning, Adam still previous to any act. I draw breath. This is, of course, to wish no matter what, to be wise, to be different, to die, and the cost, no matter how, is paradise, lost, of course, and myself owing a death. The eager ridge, the steady sea, the flat roofs of the fishing village still asleep in its bunny, though as fresh and sunny still, are not friends but things to hand. This ready flesh, no honest equal, but my accomplice now, my assassin to be, and my name stands for my historical share of care for a lying, self-made city, afraid of our living task, the dying which the coming day will ask. Christian imagery underlies a lot of Auden's shorter poems as well. Even if you look at poems such as In Praise of Limestone and in the Musée de Beaux-Arts, which I read to you, he was also writing at the same time as those poems quite a few essays on religion, lots of, and if you're into theological influences, you'd have to mention Paul, Pascal, Kierkegaard, Martin Buber, Paul Tillich, Niebuhr. Those were all very, very important to him. So his faith can't be exaggerated, but it does pose difficulties. He objected to analytical explanations of his own or anyone else's belief. He didn't like most Christian apologetics. He said that theology and Christian philosophy are written by and for believers, persons, that is, to whom God is already a subject of prayer, even if only subconsciously. So he didn't really see the point of it. And also he said that, you know, to talk about God, he said, as one talks about the weather or bimetallism, is to take his name in vain. So he didn't like, you know, bumper sticker theology, cheap talk about God. He also believed, and you can see this very much in the New Year letter I referred to in the last talk, that our faith must be well balanced by our doubt. And we need to be honest. You know, Christian faith is a faith that talks a lot about truth, but doesn't always find honesty easy. He really encourages that self-scrutiny into your own doubt and despair sometimes. He thought that to doubt for the sake of doubting, though, was pride. So you just had to be honest about where your doubt was and not just be rebellious for rebellious sake. He had a very liberal use of Christian terms. And one of his friends says, you know, for many people of his day, religious language was kept for Sundays. It was, you know, it was like your best clothes. You put them on for Sunday and you use this language. And they said the thing about Auden was he wore his Sunday best through the week. This language came out every which way, very liberally, generously, imaginatively. And people found it a bit sort of weird. And they often wondered where he stood on religious matters. And he said, I never stand anywhere, I only sit. But when he was pushed about where he stood theologically, he wrote this: I think I'm an Augustinian, not a Thomist. I would allow a little more room for the via negativa. Liturgically, I am Anglo-Catholic, though not too spiky, I hope. As to forms of church organization, I don't know what to think. I'm inclined to think that it will be back to the catacombs for all of us. As to organizations, None of the churches look too hot, do they? But what organization does? He also said that in each of us, I rather like this, and I've only come across it recently. He said that in every one of us, there's a bit of Catholic and a bit of Protestant, because, he said, truth is Catholic, but the search for it is Protestant. The truth is universal, it is Catholic, according to the whole, but you have to protest in order to get there. He also thought that the Christian theologian is in a rather embarrassing position of having to use human language, which by its nature is anthropomorphic, to deny anthropomorphic conceptions of God. So he thought that theological statements are, and this is the phrase he uses, shaggy dog stories. They have a point, but if you try hard to put your finger on it, you'll miss it. So he's rather drawn to Saint Anselm's belief, I believe in order to understand, Tertullian's I believe because it is absurd. Those phrases were very important to his own understanding. He didn't like cocky theologians who didn't think twice about, how anthropomorphic they were being when they tried to voice the divine. So he then says that orthodoxy is a reticence. Very important. Richard Harris, if any of you know, former Bishop of Oxford, is very, very keen on that phrase and thought that Auden pursues, that Christian orthodoxy is a reticence, a holding back from getting above yourself when it comes to speaking of God. Here's a poem called Friday's Child. He thought, by the way, that you could never write a poem about the crucifixion. He thought it was impossible to do that. Friday's Child, of course, the day is important in the name, is again, and this is, I'm putting you to hard work in the middle of this section. It's going to get a little bit easier. This is another slightly difficult poem, but it is a very objectively Christian poem in its themes, and also I think voices some of his own skepticisms and doubts. Friday's Child. He told us we were free to choose, but children as we were, we thought paternal love will only use force in the last resort on those too bumptious to repent. Accustomed to religious dread, it never crossed our minds he meant exactly what he said. Perhaps he frowns, perhaps he grieves, but it seems idle to discuss if anger or compassion leaves the bigger bangs to us. What reverence is rightly paid to a divinity so odd? He lets the Adam whom he made perform the acts of God. It might be jolly if we felt awe at this universal man. When kings were local, people knelt. Some try to, but who can? The self-observed, observing mind we meet when we observe at all is not alarming or unkind, but utterly banal. Though instruments at its command make wish and counter-wish come true, it clearly cannot understand what it can clearly do. Since the analogies are rot, our senses-based belief upon, we have no means of learning what is really going on, and must put up with having learned all proves or disproves that we tender of his existence are returned unopened to the sender. Now, did he really break the seal and rise again? We dare not say, but conscious unbelievers feel quite sure of Judgment Day. Meanwhile, a silence on the cross, as dead as we shall ever be, speaks of some total gain or loss, and you and I are free. To guess from the insulted face just what appearances he saves by suffering in a public place, a death reserved for slaves. He wrote that poem, by the way, in memory of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had been martyred in 1945. He was very drawn to the writings and letters of Bonhoeffer. He very much liked Bonhoeffer's declaration that we ought not to try and be more religious than God himself, and that we should love God eternally with our whole hearts, yet not so as to compromise or diminish our earthly affections, but as a kind of cantus firmus to which the other melodies of life provide the counterpoint. So our faith is the cantus firmus, the fixed line of which everything else provides different melodies around it, so that it all becomes one. Auden believed very strongly, and again, these are his words, that Christianity is a way, it is not a state. It's a way of being. And a Christian is never a thing. It's only something that you can pray to become. So you never are, you can only try to be a Christian. And I suppose if you thought of T.S. Eliot on religion, you'd think of, you know, the still point in the turning world, very Eliot image, the heart of light, the crown not of fire, the door we never opened, and so on. Where would you locate, you know, the central image for Auden? Well, it is that love of neighbor as the self, an obligation for other human beings, despite all their imperfections, an obligation to the inescapable reality of the world. That was non-negotiable for him. In all this doubt, in all the questioning about the resurrection and the virgin birth, which he had lots of questions about, he always comes back to this, the practical state, if there is one, of being Christian. Auden's Christianity shapes the tone and the content of his poems for most of his life. It was also the aspect of his life and work that seems to have been least understood by his friends and other readers. I think partly because he often talked about it in a rather frivolous way. So although it's serious in his work, when he ended up talking about religion, he was sort of frivolous about it. Somebody once said to him, I think, that if you keep talking like that, if you talk like that in previous ages, you would have been up before the Inquisitor. But people around him were a little bit sort of uneasy and a bit unsure of this side of him. Now, I want to read something which isn't very well known unless you go to Evensong and occasionally hear it sung as an anthem, because it was written for William Walton to set to music, and it's called The 12, and it's an anthem that he wrote for any feast day of an apostle. And I love it, and I love the way that William Walton sets it to music as well. If you don't know it, I do encourage you to tune in. But here is The 12, Anthem for the Feast of Any Apostle, music by Sir William Walton. So it's about, of course, the 12 apostles. The 12. Without arms or charm of culture, unimportant persons from an unimportant province, they did as the Spirit bid, went forth into a joyless world of swords and rhetoric to bring it joy. When they heard the word, some demurred, some were shocked, some mocked, but many were stirred and the word spread. Dead souls were quickened to life, the sick were healed by the truth revealed, released into peace from the gin of old sin. Men forgot themselves in the glory of the story told by the 12. Then the dark Lord, adored by this world, perceived the threat of the light to his might. From his throne he spoke to his own. The loud crowd, the sedate engines of state were moved by his will to kill. It was done. One by one they were caught, tortured and slain. O Lord my God, though I forsake thee, forsake me not, but guide me as I walk through the valley of mistrust, and let the cry of my disbelieving absence come unto thee, thou who declared unto Moses, I shall be there. Children play about the ancestral graves. The dead no longer walk. Excellent still in their splendor are the antique statues, but can do neither good nor evil. Beautiful still are the starry heavens, but our fate is not written there. Holy still is speech, but there is no sacred tongue. The truth may be told in all. 12, as the winds and months, are those who taught us these things, envisaging each in an oval glory. Let us praise them all with a merry noise. As I say, it's not that well known, the 12, but I love it. I particularly like the gin of old sin. So his version of Christianity was more or less incomprehensible to anyone who thought religion was about formal institutions or supernatural beliefs or ancestral identities or moral prohibitions, sectarian arguments, spiritual aspirations, and all those sort of things. He challenged all that. He insisted that only adults can make a religious commitment. He thought the imposition of religion on children and adolescents was absurd. He had no interest in, he said, the megalomaniac sentimentality embodied in what he calls the creeping Jesus in Dostoevsky's later writings, where the Russian people's love of Christ becomes a sort of satisfying excuse for military conquest. Auden also dismisses the popular notions of hell and damnation as morally revolting and intellectually incredible because it is conceived of in terms of human criminal law as a torture imposed upon the sinner against his will by an all-powerful God. And so, as I say, you are challenged as a Christian by his Christian faith as well as coming up alongside him. He took seriously his membership of the Anglican Church. He derived many of his moral and aesthetic ideas from Christian doctrines. He valued his church and doctrines, however, only to the extent that they helped to make it possible to love one's neighbor as oneself. Everything, that was the criterion of everything that had to be assessed by. So anything that was just a distraction from that, he had very little time for. What about prayer? Well, to pray, Auden wrote, is to pay attention, or shall we say, to listen to someone or something other than oneself. Whenever a person so concentrates their attention, be it on a landscape or a poem or a geometrical problem or an idol or the true God, that they completely forget their own ego and desire in listening to what the other has to say, they are praying. That idea of prayer being attention, that you are, as it were, like the flower that's trying to turn round towards the sun to see more in the light, is again a very heart of his Augustinian belief. He didn't have much time for petitionary prayer, prayer that asks for, you know, specific things. He said when people pray like that, they seem to be talking as if they're hoping God will make 2 and 2 make 5. He didn't really like that. And then he said he was quite a traditionalist when it came to religious language. Paul Tillich at the time was well-known theologian, of course, tried to come up with other images for God, such as the ground of being. But Auden says, I can see what leads Paul Tillich to speak of God as ground of being, but if I try to pray, O thou ground, have mercy upon us, I just start to giggle, he said. So this is not a conventional Christian faith that he has, but it is very integrated into who he is and to his intellectual searches and his emotional realities. He refers to himself as a would-be Christian because he thought that calling himself a Christian would be an unchristian act of pride. I think he rather liked the image that when somebody once said, you know, just because you're in a garage doesn't make you're a car. Just because you're in a church doesn't mean that you're a Christian. He had a very strong sense of that. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about his Christian faith, there's a very good book on the and not too long, and it's even more interesting, I think, because it's written from a secular perspective by a scholar who recognizes the importance of Christian faith to Auden in a way, as I say, that isn't always there. So here is something he wrote in a book he called A Certain World. In this world, so long as we are vigorous enough to be capable of action, God surely does not intend us to sit around thinking of and loving him like anything. Aside from rites of public worship in which we bring our bodies to God, we should direct our mental attention towards him only for so long as it takes us to learn what he wills us to do here and now. This may take only a moment if the task he sets us is easy. If hard, a little longer. But once we know what it is, we should forget all about him and concentrate our mental and physical energies upon our task. Of course, I think his task was poetry. But there you get that restless sense that don't sit around in church being pious. Once you know from God what you're being asked to do, get on with it. So what about Lent? Why Auden for Lent? Well, I hope you'll find enough to nourish you through 6 weeks if you do pick up his poems. But what I want to end with is revisiting those earlier poems that I mentioned at the start that capture something of the human condition that's so thirsty for some completeness or purpose or commitment. Here is his poem, As I Walked Out One Evening. As I walked out one evening, walking down Bristol Street, the crowds upon the pavement were fields of harvest wheat. And down by the brimming river, I heard a lover sing under an arch of the railway, love has no ending. I'll love you, dear, I'll love you till China and Africa meet. And the river jumps over the mountain and the salmon sing in the street. I'll love you till the ocean is folded and hung up to dry. And the 7 stars go squawking like geese about the sky. The years shall run like rabbits, for in my arms I hold the flower of the ages and the first love of the world. but all the clocks in the city began to whir and chime. Oh, let not time deceive you. You cannot conquer time. In the burrows of the nightmare, where justice naked is, time watches from the shadow and coughs when you would kiss. In headaches and in worry, vaguely life leaks away, and time will have his fancy tomorrow or today. Into many a green valley drifts the appalling snow. Time breaks the threaded dances and the diver's brilliant bow. Oh, plunge your hands in water, plunge them in up to the wrist, stare, stare in the basin and wonder what you've missed. The glacier knocks in the cupboard, the desert sighs in the bed, and the crack in the teacup opens a lane to the land of the dead, where the beggars raffle the banknotes and the giant is enchanting to Jack, and the lily-white boy is Aurora, and Jill goes down on her back. Oh, look, look in the mirror. Oh, look in your distress. Life remains a blessing, although you cannot bless. Oh, stand, stand at the window as the tears scold and start. You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart. It was late, late in the evening. The lovers, they were gone. The clocks had ceased their chiming, and the deep river ran on. Oh, plunge your hands in water, plunge them in up to the wrist, stare, stare in the basin and wonder what you've missed. That's not a bad thing to do in Lent. Oh, look, look in the mirror, look in your distress. Life remains a blessing, although you cannot bless. Lent and Auden both have that ability to help us see the masks that have eaten into our faces over time. They both have the ability to feel the waste of a life that isn't seeking some integrated wholeness. They both have the ability to see how we distract ourselves from frightening reckoning with ourselves. So in the poem September the 1st, 1939, he's in the bar and he notes that the lights must never go out, the music must always play. We can't cope with the silence and the darkness. We have to be distracted. In a very interesting poem called The Fall of Rome, he notes, fantastic grow the evening gowns. Even as Rome's about to fall, people are making these fantastic evening gowns, living out fantasies. Again, all part of the mask that's corrosive into our skin. Oh, if only we could tell ourselves who we have become and where we are so empty. We, he says, lie in the grass of our neglect. We lie in the grass of our neglect. And of course, as you just heard in that poem, in headaches and in worry, vaguely life leaks away. Here's his poem, If I Could Tell You. Time will say nothing, but I told you so. Time only knows the price we have to pay. If I could tell you, I would let you know. If we should weep when clowns put on their show, if we should stumble when musicians play, time will say nothing, but I told you so. There are no fortunes to be told, although because I love you more than I can say, if I could tell you, I would let you know. The winds must come from somewhere when they blow. There must be reasons why the leaves decay. Time will say nothing, but I told you so. Perhaps the roses really want to grow. The vision seriously intends to stay. If I could tell you, I would let you know. Suppose all the lions get up and go, and all the brooks and soldiers run away. Will time say nothing but I told you so? If I could tell you, I would let you know. If we should weep when clowns put on their show, such a haunting image. Auden's a poet who's looking for a way for him to live honestly. What would an honest life look like? It's a very haunting question for him, I think. And how can you heal the rift in yourself, the rift with nature? He had a very strong sense that we had become very separated from the natural. But also, how can you heal the rift within yourself? Those things I was talking to you right at the beginning, the contradictory parts of our personality. Carnival and Lent at war. Because of this, choice and responsibility are two of his great themes. And again, at a time when, you know, narratives of victimhood can often ignore the fact that we do have agency, we have a will, we have paths through pain, so that we can transform hurt rather than transmit it. Auden had a very strong sense of this and is very much the poet to converse with on these themes. He explores how and when we can seek private peace and when we must seek public duty. In his poem on Freud, he refers to Freud's technique of unsettlement. And I think that's Auden's technique as well, quite often. Simply by being honest, he unsettles. Plunge those wrists in the water. So in that poem, the 1st of September 1939, he's looking down the bar, he's in a bar in New York, and he's looking down the bar, and he writes, "Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out. The music must always play. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good." Well, that could be bleak if we also didn't know that he loves. There's a generosity in his writing. He's out to expose our illusions, but not to leave us disillusioned. And that's the great Christian vocation, it seems to me. Dispel illusions, don't leave people disillusioned. And in his famous poem, In Praise of Limestone, he ends it, "When I try to imagine a faultless love, all the life to come, what I hear is the murmur of underground streams. What I see is a limestone landscape." Auden was listening out for the underground streams in life and in the human soul. He prayed as a way to deepen attention to something other than himself. He prayed to God in order to forget his own ego. If you look through his poems, I, personal pronoun, I, is not very frequent at all. Only God could help us see ourselves from without, objectively. We fear God, not because he's a tyrant, but because he's real, and we aren't. And Auden, acknowledging all this, is still a great poet of gratitude. You get a sense of his being grateful in a culture of so much entitlement and expectation.
You should be.
On his memorial in Westminster Abbey, there are lines from his poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats engraved. "In the prison of his days, teach the freeman how to praise." Lent is a good season to see and recognize what imprisons our days, our hearts, our relationships, our connection with God, and then to seek freedom and renewed praise. Auden's work is there as an outstretched arm as friendship to you as you begin that journey. So I'm ending with the last section of that poem in memory of Yeats, sounding as fresh as ever in these days of our own times, and in itself pointing to the vocation of the poet, which Auden responded to with all he could muster. Earth, receive an honoured guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the framing of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the freeman how to praise. Thank you for being so patient and listening to me today.
Mark, thank you. I just wonder if we keep a few seconds of quiet, everybody, as we just reflect on so much we have heard this afternoon, but maybe just one or two things that have particularly struck us. So we shall pause for a moment, and then it won't surprise you that I will say a few words. Well, as someone has just said, thank you for such a rich afternoon. I wonder if we are happy to, for those who are happy to, just to turn on their cameras so we can just see each other's faces again. Mark, you have given us so much this afternoon, so much about Lent, so much about someone seeking honesty and truth, someone living through extraordinary times, someone amazingly intelligent and good with words. Among all that you gave us, a particular thing, if I may pick out, just the privilege of listening to poetry being read. And I think you said at the beginning that if you were put on the spot and who is your favorite poet, then normally you would end up with Auden. And just the way you read it and the passion behind how you read, but also what you said about him and the insights that you drew out. This is one of those moments at the end of these meetings where I could go on for hours and no one wants me to. So I'm not actually going to say much more, except on behalf of us, thank you so much for your time, your preparation. Our prayers for you in your ministry in Cambridge and much further afield. And let's all continue to be praying, of course, for the situation in Ukraine, but also for one another and those on our hearts and minds, that it may indeed be a blessed Lent, and that image of the snowfall that you gave us right at the beginning, may it be a blessed and learning Lent. Our next OCSG meeting is 14th of May, and that's Rowan Williams and speaking here in Oxford. That's going to be a live meeting, so keep your eyes on the details and which kind Ben will be sending out. I'm very conscious that one or two have kindly put questions in the chat. I think because of time and because there's so many of us here on Zoom, we won't look at them now, so apologies, because there's one or two which I would love to. But I think Mark very kindly said earlier that if anybody particularly would like to email him, is that okay, Mark? I'm not adding too much for it. I suppose now I've said it, it's hard for me to withdraw it, anyway. So, and also, of course, it's good for us to be thinking about and praying about ourselves anyway. So Mark, bless you and thank you everybody so much for coming along this afternoon and being part of OCSG and all the creativity that surrounds it. Thank you, Ben, for organising it. And again, we remember with such love Georgie and her vision for all of this. Thank you all so much. Good afternoon.